What's going on, guys? Preacher Reads here, and I asked 13 of my Booktube friends to help give recommendations to horror readers for fantasy novels that they should try out. So, if you're a horror reader or someone who loves horror and you're looking to get into fantasy, or you're just looking for more fantasy options that have horror elements within them, this is a great video for you. So let's get started with our first recommendation.
Hello, Preacher. Thank you for inviting me to share with you my pick for a fantasy series that would be perfect for fans of horror. And that took me a millisecond to make up my mind. It's going to be Ian Esselmont's Novels of the Malazan Empire. Now, many people have heard of Stephen Erikson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen, but he didn't invent the Malazan world on his own. Ian Esselmont is the co-creator of the Malazan world, and his novels of the Malazan Empire are some of the most atmospheric fantasy you will come across. And he also does include more horror elements than Stephen Erikson does, in my opinion, in his books, particularly in the first of the novels of the Malazan Empire, Night of Knives, heavy atmosphere, lots of mystery in there. And also in Stone Wielder, there's some really freaky things that happen in Stone Wielder. This is, by the way, my favorite of the 6 novels of the Malazan Empire. And then there is Blood and Bone, which is as atmospheric as it gets. It is a trek across a jungle, and not just any jungle, a jungle that is filled with horrors. All 6 of the books have horror elements, but those 3, I think, are where they are most prominent. And I just think that Ian Esselmont does a fantastic job of fleshing out the Malazan world and giving us some really cool elements that Stephen Erikson hints at in his books, but you can't get the full picture until you read Esselmont's books as well.
Hey, Preacher, thanks for having us on. Or at least my recommendation for a fantasy book for horror readers is The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. Specifically, Christopher Buehlman has written actually several other horror series, horror books before this novel, and I think this is a great blend of horror themes and elements told through in a fantasy world through the lens of a very quirky character. He makes the bitter pill, the horrific bitter pill of this world, a lot easier to swallow.
Nice. My recommendation for you horror readers out there, if you want to dive into fantasy, is Pure Nessie by Susanna Clark. Now, you're not going to read this book, and if you're a horror reader, you're not going to be scared. But I think a part about horror and that horror readers love is an atmosphere and a eeriness, a spookiness, a charm. This is more charming and enchanting than it is spooky, but it might give you that similar, like, whoa, where am I? Whereas horror is scary, this is more mysterious and strange. And I think that will make you guys who love horror really like this. It's super small. It's about this character, Pure Nessie, who is in this world of endless hallways. And I always like to pitch the book by reading the first chapter header here, because it just gives you the feel of the book. It says this: when the moon rose in the 3rd northern hall, I went to the 9th vestibule. Entry for the first day of the 5th month in the year that Albatross came to the southwestern halls. Just gives you the vibe of this. It's very enchanting, and that's what I'd recommend for you horror readers out there.
What's up, Preacher Reads peeps and beasties? It's me, it's Triple B, your friendly neighborhood bearded book beast, Chris, and I am here for this awesome collab. Thank you, Preacher, for inviting me on. I'm here to recommend some fantasy to horror enthusiasts. And I thought of a few, and I'm just going to run down them and say why I didn't pick that, and then tell you which one I chose. So at first I thought of Dresden Files, starting with Stormfront, and Repairman Jack, starting with The Tomb. Both have some fantasy and horror elements to them, but they're like modern day, and they're urban fantasy, not quite like like actual fantasy. So I said, nah, I can't do that. Then I thought of The Witcher. It definitely has some monsters. It's fantasy, has some horror vibes. Same with Empire of the Vampire. But then I just thought other people might do those. They're very popular. Horror people curious about fantasy might have heard of these. They're fantastic. Highly recommend them, but wasn't quite what I was thinking. So then I thought, I know, I got just the one. And I'm talking about We Are the Dead, Book 1 of the Last War trilogy by Mike Shackle. Not everybody's heard of this, and it's fantastic, and they need to check it out. The good guys lose the war thanks to the bad guys enlisting the help of said demonic forces. And now you have a city under siege, being held captive, almost like World War II with the Jewish and the Nazis. And you have these people, these just regular everyday people that are doing little things to help the cause. And the story goes on from there. And it is really good. It's got a lot of freaky parts. It's got a lot of good fantasy parts. And it's just an awesome, well-written story that I highly recommend. So you should check it out. Thank you again, Preacher. I appreciate it. I hope everybody has a fantastic day and reads all the books on this list, because there's some awesome people recommending things on this list. Have a great day, Beasties, and I will see you in the next one.
Hey Preacher, Andrew's Wizardly Reads here, and you wanted a recommendation from me for fantasy that horror fans could read. And the first thing that came to mind was Obsidian Path, which is Michael R. Fletcher's Blackstone Heart, book number 1. This has got undead, this has got necromancy, this has got nihilism, very, very, very grimdark, and frankly, very, very eye-opening. It's graphic, it's got strong language, and yet it's still a compelling and eye-opening fantasy story that I believe horror fans will find incredibly, incredibly enjoyable. And the next 2 books in this series are just as awesome.
Hello, I'm David from Four Corners of the Page. Preacher, you're an absolute legend, and today I want to take you up on your challenge by talking about Blackstone Heart, which is the first book in the Obsidian Path trilogy, soon to be a quartet, I believe, by self-pub hero, self-pub legend, Michael R. Fletcher. Now, I've been thinking about the best way to explain this book to you, to pitch this book to you. I've decided the best way to do that is to essentially tell you what the first 20 pages are about, because in the first 20 pages, our hero, from a first-person perspective, crawls his way out of the ground. He is bloody and skeletal and gory. He has no idea who he is. He has no idea where he is. All he knows is that he's ravenous. He's very, very hungry. A few hundred meters away, he comes across some kind of hut, some kind of camp. An elderly man comes out ostensibly to try and help him. Our hero brutally murders this guy out of his starvation. He stays in this hut for several weeks, several months, until eventually a copy of himself stumbles into the camp, looking identical to him and seemingly having exactly the same hunger. And the novel continues from there. It's mental. Now, I think this book is perfect for horror fans looking to get into fantasy for a few different reasons. It's got monsters, it's got brutality, it's got people hacking into each other. It's also got a layer of that eldritch horror that so many people like these days. It's super popular these days. These kind of cosmic entities beyond our control, seeking to attack us, seeking to hurt us. That question of whether we can harness them or not is a big question in Blackstone Heart. But the reason I love this series, I can't remember where I saw it, but I once saw the definition of horror as the sudden realization that everything you know is suddenly and irrevocably different from how you imagined. And Michael R. Fletcher has that in spades. The other thing I should say is that the pace is extremely fast in this series. Book 1 is about 400 pages. Book 2 and 3, I believe, are a little bit longer. I read this entire trilogy in about 5 days. About 1,200 pages in about 5 days, which is super unusual for me. I read book 1 in one sitting. You are not going to find a writer as easy to get into as Michael R. Fletcher. I'd kind of put him in the same vein as Stephen King, Dan Simmons in that sense. Just truly magnificent. I would say the series does have some flaws, but despite those flaws, you will find yourself reading to the end and you will not forget the journey. So Preacher, that is my recommendation to you and your viewers. For more book and book-like material, please head over to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Hey, what's up, bookworms? Are you a horror fan who's never really gotten into fantasy? You're kind of looking for a good gateway. Well, this was easy. This was super easy for me. Stephen King's The Dark Tower, which if you're a horror fan, you've probably already heard of or have read at this point. But in case you haven't, I think the reason I would recommend The Dark Tower is because it's not really necessarily a horror series or a fantasy horror series. It's a mashup of several genres. You got sci-fi in there, you got horror, you got, fantasy, you got coming of age, you got some sci-fi, you got some westerns, a little bit of everything. So Stephen King takes everything and kind of throws it into a blender in the best kind of way. But with this, it's like you want some really scary monsters. It's got it the whole time. You've got the Man in Black. You got Rhea the Coos. You got the Crimson King. You've got, I can't think of the vampire guy's name. But there are lots of characters in here that I feel like you'll get those horror vibes. And there's horrific stuff that happens in every single book and in this prequel comic series. Plenty of things that a horror fan would really, really like. And this is a good way to kind of cut your teeth into, poring over the maps, the beginning people of fantasy will do, and looking at where the characters are going, building this cast of characters that are going on a great quest, a crusade of some sort. And it's got a little bit of everything. Magic, it's got magic in it. It's got scary monsters. It's got really cool weapons. It's got all kinds of interdimensional screwy stuff that you would find in a good horror book. I think it would be a great place for you guys to start. And I think that you'll be quite surprised with how much, hey, maybe fantasy and horror aren't quite so different after all.
Hey folks, so for a fantasy novel that I think is perfect for horror fans, I can think of the one that immediately came to mind was a book that was actually came out like a month ago, and it is Once Was Willem by M.R. Carey. This is a historical fantasy set somewhere in 1100s England, and it's the story of a creature that was once Willem, who he passed away, and then a year later, when a wizard comes to town, his parents, out of desperation, go to the wizard to get him resurrected because they want their son back. But the wizard has his own agenda, and what comes from the grave is far from anything that they could hope for. So this is like a first-person narration. We get Once Was Willem's story told after of the events that happens after he returns, and it's just brilliant. It just is really entertaining, almost cinematic novel of a motley crew that comes together to deal with just this conflict that the village becomes embroiled in. As far as the horror element goes, it can be equal parts depraved, grotesque, weird, strange. This is a book that draws heavily on historical fiction of the time. It has quite a bit of fantasy elements. It incorporates English folklore. It incorporates religion, because heaven and hell do play a part in this. And it's just a really entertaining ride from start to finish. I can see this easily being on a few people's top 10s list of this year, with good reason. It's short, it's punchy, and it was just an entertaining read. Worth checking out. So, thank you, Preacher Reads, for having me on the collab, and I hope you give this book a shot.
Hi, I'm Bookborn from the channel Bookborn that covers fantasy and sci-fi, and I'm excited to give you guys, horror fans, a recommendation today. Now, I haven't read a ton of horror. I've mostly only read fantasy adjacent horror, which wasn't the point of today's video. We didn't want to get into that. So I have to make some assumptions about why horror readers love horror, and I think some of it might be the dread, the feeling of dread it might give you, especially existential dread, probably that they are usually very gripping and have a lot of focus on characters' thoughts and emotions and feelings going through that. So I was trying to think of what I wanted to recommend, and I decided to cheat, and I'm giving you guys a sci-fi. I hope that's okay. But I'm going to recommend a short story collection called Exhalation by Ted Chiang. And one thing I think Exhalation does a great job at is that sense of existential dread. But instead of coming from a place of like gore or body horror, as often horror does, this instead elicits that same dread through advances in technology and the unknown expanse of space and the universe and what's out there. So I think it might give you similar feelings. I hope you enjoy this, and if you do, he has other short story collections, and let me know what you think.
Hello everyone, Sam from Samwise here, and if I had to recommend a fantasy novel for people who mostly read horror novels, one of the top recommendations has got to be The Radiant King by David Dalglish. This book is almost like if you took Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, but instead it was Joan of Arc, and you mixed that with Berserk, the manga. That's a lot of what The Radiant King is. There's a lot of heroic fantasy elements and also Dark Souls, Berserk, very Cthulhu type things going on in the background of this novel. I found this novel to be quite gripping. It is not fast-paced in the sense of every scene is an action scene, but it is very fast-moving in the sense of there is almost no fat on this novel. Dalglish takes ideas and concepts that normally would be stretched out over an entire trilogy or even larger series and puts them all in this one book. It's about these 6 siblings who have been granted the blessing or curse, depending on how you look at it, of immortality. They don't die. They live forever. If they die, they will resurrect a few years later, their body will reassemble, and they will come back to life. And this book specifically talks about how over the many centuries that they've been alive, they have taken the vow never to rule over nations or to be a part of any type of big religion or rule over people. And one of these siblings has broken his oath. And so a couple of the siblings band together to try to stop this one who's become sort of a tyrannical leader and started a blood cult that is trying to summon an ancient eldritch god back into the world. So this book has body horror elements, it has cosmic horror, like I said, Lovecraftian stuff, and if you think of the horror elements that you get from Berserk, there's a lot of it here. This novel isn't quite as dark as Berserk, so don't be concerned about that. But there's a lot here to love for horror fans. This isn't grimdark, but it is dark fantasy, and I think it's the perfect recommendation, so check it out.
So my fantasy recommendation for horror readers is going to be The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee, book 1 of the 5 Warrior Angels trilogy. And while this has some horrific elements into it, I think what really makes it an interesting read for a horror person coming to fantasy is it has some mysterious elements to it, it has a lot of action, and it does have a lot of bad things happening to people. And I just think it is something that in a grimdark world can fit towards a lot of horror readers' tastes.
What's up, Jake here from Nerd Level Rising, and today we're recommending some fantasy books for horror readers, and where my head goes is the novella collections for Malazan by Steven Erikson. This, don't be intimidated, okay? You don't have to read the massive, sprawling, epic Malazan books. You can read these without any prior knowledge from the series, and you can leave it at that. You don't have to go read the series. You certainly can if you want to, but you don't have to by any means. This can stand on its own. This collection has 3 novellas. It's Blood Follows, The Lees of Laughter's End, and The Healthy Dead. Here we are following Bauklin and Corbel Broach, who are 2 necromancers, and their manservant and mansuport Reese, and they're just going through some adventures, and they're all very dark and macabre and creepy and just really unsettling in a lot of ways, but it's also really, really funny. The humor in these novellas is just peak Malazan humor, in my opinion. I love these characters to death. They're so engaging, they're so fun, and they're also very dreadful also at the same time. So check it out if you're interested. There's a lot of horror-ish themes, but a lot of some fantasy stuff in there too. I think it's a good stepping stone, and they're short, bite-sized stories. You'll get through them really quick. Not intimidating at all, like the main Malazan series might be for some people. So check it out, the Bauklin and Corbel Broach novella collections by Steven Erikson.
What's up, horror fans? Thank you, Preach, for allowing me to add my voice to this video. I'm super excited to talk about one of my favorite books of all time. As always, I'm Shay from the channel Zachary Shay, where I talk about fantasy books, comics, manga. Today, I'm talking about Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Lietzau. The mind is a malleable thing. Soil, if you're feeling poetic. Depending on the seed, anything will grow in it, from graceful gardens to idyllic meadows, from weedy forests to foggy swamps. Harmonious or chaotic, peaceful or perilous, healthy or ill. It's all a matter of seeds. There is a myth that soldiers aren't afraid when they charge into battle. It's a lie. The fear is always there, worming through the pits of their stomachs and crawling over their shaking hands. Life or death depends on their ability to kill this fear and let that other beast take over. The one that fought, the one that maimed, the one that turned green boys into killers, the one that survived. And what is Dreams of the Dying about? So in Dreams of the Dying, we follow the character of Jespar Delveric. At least that's what he was called when I read the book, since the change in publication is now Jespar Trey Moresti. And this is a character that suffers from severe bouts of melancholia, depression, childhood PTSD, kind of wartime PTSD from his time as a mercenary. And he is haunted by these horrific nightmares of this burning corpse. And he is hired to do this certain job. So we have mystery elements, we have horror elements, primarily focused in this extremely fantasy world. We have fantasy creatures, we have fantasy elements, we have different magic systems, but it is all tied into this very horror, very thriller, very mystery coded story. And I think that Jespar's journey will be inspiring for those who have suffered from depression, while also being very horrific and it'll scratch that horror itch for you for sure. So Jespar is basically hired to delve into the mind of the richest man in this archipelago, and he's kind of in this catatonic state, and he's hired to find a dream magic user that specializes in dreams, and to go into this man's dreams. It's pretty much like nightmare fuel plus Inception in a fantasy world. It's absolutely amazing. They have to delve into his dreams, delve into nightmares. It's just an absolutely brilliant read, and The Cure for Living should be coming out this year. So yeah, my pick is Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Lietzau. Peace.
If you're someone who's typically into horror, but you're trying to delve into fantasy, just dip the toe, or even maybe go waist deep, I got a book for you. And this is coming from a guy who's only read one single horror book in his life, and it's John dies at the end, spoiler alert. But conveniently, I just finished a fantasy book that I felt had more horror aspects in it than other ones I've read. And that is The Rage of the Dragons. The Rage of Dragons. So this book is very fantasy in the sense that it is a completely made up new world with a cast of characters, some of whom can do magic, like get really strong or literally control dragons in a battle. And we're thrust into this years-long war following a main character with zero special abilities or magic. So he's kind of like an everyman. But then something horrible happens to him and he just gets pissed off and literally will stop at nothing to seek vengeance. This is a revenge story. The author calls it John Wick, but like in the Bronze Age. Literally non-stop action, heart-pumping action. And so you're probably like, that doesn't sound like horror to me. Well, maybe it does, because it's heart pumping. Horror gets the juices flowing. But the reason I feel like this is a nice segue into fantasy is because this book has a lot of underworld elements to it. Without giving away any spoilers, some of the magic is related to an underworld where there are demons who are terrifying. And so when I think of horror, I think of terrifying demons. There's ghouls, there's goblins. Just kidding, there's no goblins. Definitely demons though. And they're scary. The scenes in the underworld literally made me afraid and gave me nightmares. But that aspect of it is really about 20% of the book, where the other 80% is kind of like training and fighting and learning about the caste system and watching our main character go absolutely sicko mode on his enemies. This is a really fun book. I would say 90% of the book was fighting, but it had a nice, really interesting story along with it. So yeah, Rage of Dragons. This book is awesome. You're gonna love it. And at very least, you're gonna have a ton of fun reading it. It's low-key a thickie, but you're gonna fly through it, trust me. Also, it's a great audiobook. Great audiobook. Shout out to Preacher for including me in this video. Zadrunas Ilgauskas. I was really trying to make that one for you, Preacher.
All right, guys, I hope you got a bunch of good recommendations, but I have a few for you as well before we leave. To get started, I'm going to recommend to you the series that got me into fantasy as an adult. See, I was a horror reader. I basically only read horror until I was recommended The Blade Itself and the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I'm telling you, this is such a good entry point for somebody who likes horror, especially for the character elements and just the overall tone of the world. This series that's expanded past now even just the first 3 books just has a horrific tone and feel and does characters a lot like some of the best horror writers. I struggled with a lot of different genres, especially sci-fi, as a horror reader because sometimes the character work just felt lacking, and character work can be so important in horror novels. But Joe Abercrombie is a character genius. And so if you're looking to get into fantasy and you want to start with a big epic series by an awesome author who's well loved, check out First Law by Joe Abercrombie. Next up, if you're not trying to dive in to epic fantasy with these new worlds, but you want to get some fantasy vibes, I highly recommend Sandman Slim by Richard Kadrey. This series is urban fantasy, and the main character has been sent to hell during a magical event gone wrong with some people who backstabbed him, and now he has returned from hell to get revenge. There's some awesome horror elements within this, especially some of the creatures and the people and the beings who show up within this series, but it definitely is an urban fantasy novel. And so this is a lot like Dresden Files, if you've ever heard Dresden Files before, but this is a great mishmash of fantasy with horror elements, and it's not gonna force you to dive into these new epic worlds where you have to learn languages and you have to learn all of these places and look at maps. It is set in the real world. Check out Sandman Slim by Richard Kadrey. Last up, I'm going to recommend one of my favorite books of 2024, and that was Herald by Rob J. Hayes, which is one of 3 in the God Eater saga currently out. Now, this is a trilogy of trilogies. So there's Herald, and then there's 2 prequel novellas that go prior to Herald, and then he's going to put out 3 more and 3 more again, and we're going to have a trilogy of trilogies. Now, this is an awesome fantasy setting, but it is dark and it is creepy, and the problem that is being engaged with, the events that occur within this book, I'm trying to be as spoiler-free as possible, are horrific in nature. It is dark, and it has some really interesting monsters and beings and problems that exist in a lot of ways through a horror lens. And so I would highly recommend checking out Herald and the 2 novellas in the God Eater saga by Rob J. Hayes. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to all of the booktubers who hung out with me on this video and gave their recommendations. Go follow them. You can find their links down in the description. If you would like to support this channel, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a member to our channel. I'm going to scroll right here. The members of our channel, they are awesome and are helping support me in being able to continue to make content and do it at a pace that I can only do if I'm able to purchase some different video editing softwares and do some things a little bit differently. And so thank you guys so much for supporting me. I'm going to be out of town for the next week, but we'll be dropping a video next week, and I hope you guys will join us. Thank you guys so much for being a part. Make sure you hop into the Book Street Boys Discord server. Link is in the description as well, and I will see you guys later.